This lesson we're going to be covering arrays and then also objects and how we can iterate through and get the content contained within the arrays and outputting that content on the page. So we're selecting the page element. We're going to create a simple array that's going to contain different data types and then output those data types. I'll show you how you can do it with a for loop and then a for each, and then create a more complex object that's going to contain an array of objects. And notice the structure is going to be all the same, which is going to make it easy for us as we're looping through that array and outputting it on the page. So it's easy to select the values in order to use those values within our code. Both objects and arrays can contain multiple values. Let's do a few examples of an array and then also of an object. So the idea for an array is that we use the square brackets and it can contain multiple items within the array, and then we can reference them using the index value. And the index value is just the order that the particular value is going to appear. And this also can contain objects as well as it can contain arrays. So we've got a wide variety of different data values that we can use here, and also can contain arrays as well. So arrays can be nested within arrays and we can access the values of those items. So let's take a look and we'll see what the array looks like within the terminal. I'll make this slightly bigger so it's a little bit easier to see. And this particular array, so we've got a length property, and all arrays will come with a length value. So at any time with the array, you can retrieve back the length, as this is a default property of the array. So it'll basically tell you how many items there are within the array, and this is just on the root, so it's not going to count that it's got another array and then there's some items within that array. So we would have to access that array to find out the length of the number of items within that particular array that's nested within our main array. And you see that within the console where it's got the length there. So this particular one has 3 items and it's just 0, 1, 2. And we can also access the value of the length of that particular array. So let's do that. And for this, we need to select the item by its index value. And arrays start with the index value of 0. So if we have 8 items in here starting with 0, that means that the last one has an index value of 7. So let's see if that's correct. And you can see that in the terminal, in the console, that it's outputting the particular array. So let's use that, and here if we want to get the length of the items in that array, then we can do it this way and we can return back the property value of 3, as there's 3 items within that nested array. So let's clear the terminal, and you can clear the terminal with the rounded brackets, or you can press the clear console up here, or you can use the shortcut keys in order to clear the contents of the console. So now let's dive deeper into selecting some of the content from here. So if we have the items, if we want to return back the value of first, that's relatively easy because we can just make a selection using the index value. I'm going to set up a variable, and then we'll update the value of the variable. And this right now is just going to be outputted into the terminal. So right now I'm just going to set the value to none. And within the terminal or console, we're going to use the console log to output the value. So this is going to represent the value of val. And now let's select some of the items within the my array. So if we want to select the first one, how do we assign the value of val to be the first item within the array? And so arrays are 0 based. So it starts with the index of 0. So if it's a string that we're trying to assign, it's relatively easy where we just select the string. So to get 2, it's actually going to be the index value of 1. And that's going to return back the second item within the array, which has a value of 2. So in order to get the more complex ones, so let's move all the way to 6. And this is going to return back an object. And for the object itself, it can contain multiple items within that object. And they're all going to be referenced using the name in order to get the value from the contents of the object. So for this case, if we want to return back the name Laurence, and it could very well have multiple values in there, and I can just create first one. So if we want to select the first one, then how would we do that? So we need to reference the property name, just as we've seen before with the objects in the last lesson. So we can use the bracket notation or the dot notation. So selecting first is going to return back this particular value that's assigned to it. So that's my full name there, and it's returning that back. And we can also go even deeper within returning back the content and navigating through it. And it is important to try this out, so creating an array and then creating some objects and arrays within that, and you can also nest additional objects and arrays within there as well. And one of the benefits of an array over an object is that these items within the array, so it's a lot easier to loop through because it's just a count of the index value. So we know that with an array, we're using the index, which is a numeric value, and we know that this is how many items we have, and we can just count through them and reference the content back. So let's go back into it and select the index value of 7, which is going to return back the array that has the multiple items. And depending on what we want to return back, we would use the index value to return back the associated value, which are all going to be numbers, and they're actually corresponding with what the index is. So right now we're looking in the my array, we're using the item, return back the item with index value of 7, which is going to be this entire array. And then from that array, we're selecting the item with the index value of 1, which is going to be the second item in the array. And that's how we're able to retrieve back and return that second item value. And also arrays are a lot easier to output content. So let's say, for instance, we want to do a simple loop. We want to loop through the contents of the array. We know that arrays have a length property. So we can say that, well, x is less than length, or x is less than 8. But we know that if we add additional items into the array, then we want to make it dynamic when we're looping through. So we don't always want to be having a set value that we're looping through. And that's where we would use the length in order to create the loop, to loop through the items and output the contents. So we can do it this way, where we've got the console log, we've got the my array, and we use the value of x to serve up the index and reference the content that's associated with it. So that gives us a quick way to loop through all of the contents of the array. JavaScript has a number of ways to do this. One of my preferred ways to do it is using the for each method. And this is a way to quickly loop through the values. You can also get the index value, and then you can get the total array, so all the contents of the array. And I'm using the arrow format, so this is just returning back the function, anonymous function with the arrow, and then out here is between the curly brackets is where we can work with the output, the response back. So returning back the value of val, and I comment this out, and I'll comment that out, so we don't have any additional content within the console. So now we're listing out first, 2, 3, 0, 100, true, and that's just going through all of the items within the array and giving us a quick and easy way to output that content. We also have access to its index value. So the index is going to be just whatever, because this is an array, we're outputting the index values. So right now we're doing the value and then the index value that's associated with it. The total array is just going to be the full collection that's available within the main array that's being sent in within the loop. So you do have access to it. You can reference it as now as total array or my array. It's still going to be referencing that same array. So if you were to take total array and add to the array something in the end, what do you think is going to happen to the original array? And if you said that, what's going to happen to the original array is that we're going to be updating it. You're correct, because now if I clear the terminal and if I type my array, we've got it populated with end. Even though we're referencing it as total array and we're updating that array, it's still referencing, just as the objects, that same memory location. So it's not distinguishing between the two ways to reference that object, and it's updating the main object, which is the array, with the contents. So that's why both of them now are going to contain the same values, and we can't actually get access to total array outside the curly brackets because that's within the scope of the for each loop. So this was just a demonstration of what type of content we can add in, and if you want to add in a count, you can do that as well. Save it, so that's going to add in a count every time it iterates through the items that are contained within the original array. And one other thing to note as well, so even though the original array is getting bigger, it's not affecting that loop because we're coming in and we're outputting it according to what was the original array. So we're updating the total array, which isn't going to affect that. It's going to be constantly updating and creating another iteration within the items of that array. And typically, you're most commonly going to just be selecting the value, but the index and the total array is going to be there if you do need it. And then one of the benefits of using the array, so I'm going to comment that out, is that it provides us an easy way to loop through the items that are contained in there, because this is numeric, so I've given you a couple examples of that. So that's why a lot of times when we do have JSON data or JavaScript objects, that we've structured the items within an array that's going to be contained within the main object. So let's create an object, and I'll just call it my object 2. So using the curly brackets. And then if we have a list of people, and this is going to be associated to an array. And then to make it more readable, we can do a separate line, add in some white space to make it more readable. Now you don't have to in order to create the proper structure, but this just makes it human readable. And one of the reasons that we do use JSON and JavaScript objects is that it's really easy to read the contents that are contained within the object. So let's create a list of people. So they can have first name and assign a value to the first name. And then we just comma separate the items that are contained within the object. And actually this needs to be an object because we want to have multiple items within the array. So we can start with just the one item. And let's list out the my object 2. So we've got an array called people, and then within people we just have the one item. And let's add a few other ones. So use last name. And when I am creating these types of objects, I'll create the first item just as a template, and then I can repurpose that to add other items into the array. So let's save that, output the contents of my object 2 into the console. So there's the first item. And as I mentioned, it is beneficial to have it within an array so that you can loop through, select people, and then loop through the contents of people. So this is just going to be an item within the array, just like we had the strings and just like we had up here within this example. So that means that it should be comma separated. And we want to keep the structure the same way, where we've got the first name, the last name, and the age. So that way, as we loop through the people array, we can select the property names, and we know that they're not going to be changing. And this is one of the things that you do need to, when you are creating these complex objects with arrays, where you have multiple items that you want to list out, you want to make sure that you're keeping the structure the same. So let's make some updates to the content. And so now within the my object 2, we've got a couple people within the array. And we're going to loop through them and then output them on the page. Let's add in one more using the same template structure that we just created. We've got the first name, last name, and age. 3 people, or 3 items within the array. We notice with the array as well, we do have the length for the array. So the challenge is to loop through and output them on the page. We've already selected output 1, so we'll just add it to output 1. And so we're selecting the my object 2. And the problem here is that it's not an array, so we're not going to be able to loop through it. So we need to select the array, which is the item with the property of people. So select that, and that gives us the array, just as we saw over here, that we can loop through. And then create the anonymous function, where we're picking up the contents of each item within the array as a variable called val, and then using them, outputting them within the response. So for now, I'll just output the contents of val. So that gives us the 3 people that are currently within our array structure. Because the name, the last name, and the age are all property names that we can reuse, if we select out the first name, that will output all of the first names. And now if we want to output it and add it to output 1, we can do that by getting the inner HTML, and then we're just going to add to it the val first name. And also I'm going to add a line break so that we can distinguish between each one of the items. So now we're outputting it on the page. And just to update this, I'm going to be switching from concatenating the strings in the output to the template literals. So those are using those backticks that you have on your, just to the left of the 1 on most keyboards. And in order to bring in variables, you can use the $ and the curly brackets. So that will output the content this way onto the page. I can make it slightly bigger so it's easier to read. And let's also select the last name as well. And we'll output all of the contents of each one of those items. And then lastly, let's output the age on the page. And save that. So making the structure of the object the same and keeping them as items within the array makes it really easy to work with the data that's contained in there. And you'll find that a lot of those complex JSON objects are structured this way just because it's going to be easy to read the content and see it, human readable, and then also it's going to be easier to work with it and iterate through the contents that are contained within the object.